Debt is usually described as a problem, a burden, a mistake, a temporary excess that must eventually be corrected. But modern economies do not behave as if debt were a problem. They behave as if debt were a requirement. For decades, economic stability has depended not on reducing debt but on expanding it. Not occasionally, continuously. When debt grows, the system appears stable. When debt growth slows, crises emerge. Recessions do not begin when debt is high. They begin when debt stops expanding fast enough. This is not an anomaly. It is not policy failure. It is not political incompetence. It is structural. Modern economies are not temporarily burdened by debt. They are structurally dependent on permanent debt expansion. This video is not about irresponsible spending. It is not about moral hazard. It is not about who borrowed too much or who should have known better. It is about how the system itself is organized. At the state level, budgets are designed around debt sustainability, not elimination. At the corporate level, growth is often secondary to leverage and refinancing. At the household level, access to housing, education, and basic participation increasingly requires long-term indebtedness. Debt is not what happens when the system fails. Debt is what allows the system to function. This creates a fundamental inversion. Economic growth is no longer the primary objective. It becomes a secondary effect, a mechanism to service existing obligations. The real product is not output. It is debt itself. In this structure, reducing debt is not stabilizing. It is destabilizing. This is why austerity repeatedly fails. Why deleveraging triggers contraction. Why every crisis response ultimately relies on restoring credit flows. In the following sections, we will examine this structure across three layers: the state, the corporate sector, and private households. Not as separate problems, but as interconnected components of a single debt-dependent system. The question is not whether this system is good or bad. The question is simpler and more uncomfortable. What happens when the system can no longer expand debt fast enough to sustain itself? At the state level, debt is not treated as something to be eliminated. It is treated as something to be managed. This distinction matters. In theory, public debt is often framed as an accumulated excess, the result of overspending, political short-termism, or fiscal irresponsibility. In practice, modern states operate as if debt is a permanent feature of the system. Budgets are not constructed around the goal of repayment. They are constructed around the goal of sustainability. Sustainability does not mean reducing debt. It means ensuring that debt can continue to exist without triggering instability. This is why balanced budgets are the exception, not the rule. And when they do occur, they are often temporary and economically disruptive. A modern state requires a continuous issuance of debt for several reasons at once. First, government bonds are not just liabilities. They are assets for the financial system. Pension funds, insurance companies, banks, and central banks all rely on sovereign debt as a foundational instrument. It provides collateral. It anchors yield curves. It defines risk-free benchmarks. Removing or significantly shrinking this supply would not stabilize the system. It would destabilize it. Second, fiscal policy itself is constrained by debt dynamics. Spending decisions are less about what the state wants to do and more about what debt markets will tolerate. Interest rates, refinancing conditions, and rollover schedules silently shape policy boundaries. The state does not ask, how do we pay this back? It asks, can we service this indefinitely? This logic creates a structural dependency. If economic growth slows, tax revenues weaken. If revenues weaken, deficits expand. If deficits expand, new debt must be issued. And if new debt cannot be issued on acceptable terms, the system enters crisis. This is why recessions often coincide with fiscal stress. Not because debt is too high, but because the ability to expand it has weakened. Austerity is frequently presented as a corrective mechanism. In reality, it functions as a destabilizer. Cutting spending during downturns reduces incomes. Reduced incomes lower tax receipts. Lower tax receipts increase deficits. The attempt to reduce debt ends up reinforcing the very dynamics it aims to escape. This is not a failure of execution. It is a failure of the premise. The state cannot deleverage without shrinking the economic base that supports its obligations. This is why crisis responses consistently follow the same pattern. Deficits expand. Central banks intervene. Bond markets are stabilized. Debt growth resumes. Regardless of political rhetoric, the outcome is remarkably consistent. Public debt does not decline after crises. It steps up to a higher plateau. Each crisis resets the system at a new level of indebtedness, which then becomes the new baseline for stability. From this perspective, state debt is not a temporary financing tool. It is a structural pillar. It supports the financial system. It enables countercyclical policy. It absorbs shocks that would otherwise propagate through markets and households. The problem is not that debt exists. The problem is that the system cannot function without its continuous expansion. This creates an asymmetry. Growth is encouraged when it supports debt servicing. It is discouraged when it threatens financial stability. Fiscal discipline applies selectively and often only to preserve creditor confidence. The state, in this structure, is not primarily an engine of development. It is a manager of obligations. Debt is not the consequence of policy. It is the condition under which policy operates. And once this logic is accepted at the state level, it inevitably reproduces itself elsewhere in the system. At the corporate level, the same structural logic reappears, but in a different form. Corporations are often portrayed as engines of productivity, entities that invest, innovate, and grow in response to market demand. In practice, many large corporations operate less as production systems and more as balance sheet management structures. Growth still matters, but it is frequently subordinate to leverage. Access to cheap and abundant debt reshapes corporate priorities. Investment decisions are filtered through financing conditions. Expansion is pursued when credit is available, not necessarily when demand requires it. This is why periods of low interest rates are consistently associated with rising corporate indebtedness. Debt becomes attractive not because firms are struggling, but because borrowing is cheaper than equity, and refinancing is easier than organic growth. This dynamic alters the function of profit. Profit is no longer primarily a signal of productive success. It becomes a tool for servicing obligations, supporting credit ratings, and maintaining access to capital markets. In this context, debt is not a last resort. It is a strategic instrument. Stock buybacks illustrate this inversion clearly. Rather than reinvesting earnings into capacity or innovation, firms often borrow to repurchase their own shares. This boosts valuations, supports executive compensation structures, and signals financial strength, while increasing leverage. From a productive standpoint, nothing has improved. From a financial standpoint, the balance sheet has been optimized. Mergers and acquisitions follow a similar logic. Cheap debt enables consolidation. Scale increases. Market power expands. But the underlying objective is often not efficiency, but refinancing and cash flow extraction. The corporation becomes a vehicle for debt circulation. This structure creates fragility that is often mistaken for resilience. As long as credit conditions remain favorable, high leverage appears manageable. Cash flows cover interest payments. Debt is rolled over. Ratings are maintained. But when financing tightens, the system reacts abruptly. Corporations do not fail primarily because demand disappears. They fail because refinancing becomes expensive or impossible. This is why corporate crises tend to coincide with credit contractions, not with gradual declines in profitability. Once again, the pattern repeats. When stress emerges, the response is not widespread deleveraging. It is intervention. Central banks lower rates. Liquidity facilities are expanded. Credit markets are stabilized. The goal is not to reduce corporate debt, but to prevent its sudden repricing. Debt levels remain elevated. The system resets at a higher baseline. This outcome is often described as moral hazard. But the deeper issue is structural. A corporate sector built around leverage cannot collectively deleverage without triggering collapse. If firms simultaneously attempt to reduce debt, investment falls. Employment weakens. Revenues decline. Defaults increase. The attempt to restore balance destabilizes the system. As a result, corporate debt becomes self-reinforcing. Low rates encourage borrowing. Borrowing increases systemic dependence on low rates. This dependence constrains future policy. Financial stability becomes tied to debt preservation. The corporation, in this structure, is no longer primarily a unit of production. It is a node in a debt network. Its survival depends less on what it produces, and more on its ability to continuously access credit on acceptable terms. This does not eliminate growth, but it reframes it. Growth becomes a requirement for debt maintenance, not an independent objective. And once this logic dominates the corporate sector, it inevitably extends to the final layer of the system: private households. At the household level, debt is often framed as a personal choice, a decision, a preference, a matter of financial discipline or irresponsibility. Within the structure of modern economies, this framing is misleading. For most households, debt is not optional. It is the condition of participation. Access to housing increasingly requires long-term leverage. Education is financed through future income claims. Healthcare costs are smoothed through credit. Even basic consumption is stabilized through revolving debt. Households are not borrowing to speculate. They are borrowing to enter systems that no longer function without upfront capital. This shifts the role of income. Wages are no longer primarily a means of accumulation. They become a servicing mechanism. Monthly income is organized around existing obligations: mortgages, student loans, consumer credit, insurance premiums. The household balance sheet mirrors the logic of the state and the corporation. Stability depends not on eliminating debt, but on maintaining the ability to service it. This is why household deleveraging is rare and disruptive. When households collectively reduce borrowing, consumption contracts. When consumption contracts, corporate revenues fall. When revenues fall, employment weakens. The attempt to reduce private debt propagates upward through the system. This is not theoretical. It is observable. Periods of widespread household deleveraging are associated with recessions, not recoveries. Stability returns only when credit flows are restored. This creates a paradox. Households are told to be prudent, yet the system requires them to remain indebted. Individual caution, when applied collectively, produces systemic instability. As a result, policy responses consistently aim to preserve household credit access. Interest rates are lowered. Mortgage markets are supported. Loan forbearance programs are introduced. The objective is not to free households from debt, but to prevent mass default. Default is the true threat, not because it is morally wrong, but because it breaks the servicing chain. When defaults rise, banks weaken. When banks weaken, credit tightens. When credit tightens, the entire structure contracts. Household debt functions as a stabilizer precisely because it binds future income to present obligations. It anchors expectations. It smooths consumption. It converts uncertain futures into predictable payment streams. From the system's perspective, this is not a flaw. It is a feature, but it comes with a structural constraint. Households cannot meaningfully escape this loop without undermining the system that depends on their participation. Mass debt forgiveness, rapid deleveraging, or widespread withdrawal from credit markets do not produce balance. They produce shock. This is why such measures are treated as exceptional, temporary, and tightly controlled. The system tolerates household distress. It does not tolerate household exit. In this structure, private debt is not an outcome of excess. It is the mechanism that integrates individuals into the broader economic order. The household is not an autonomous unit making free financial choices. It is the final layer in a debt-dependent architecture. And when all three layers, state, corporate, and household, operate under the same logic, debt ceases to be a problem waiting to be solved. It becomes the foundation that must be continuously maintained. This was Vox Analytics. We analyze systems, not headlines. If you want to understand how power actually moves, stay with us.